Welcome to Freya's Fairy Tales, where we believe fairy tales are both stories we enjoyed as children and something that we can achieve ourselves. Each week, we will talk to authors about their favorite fairy tales when they were kids and their adventure to holding their very own fairy tale in their hands. At the end of each episode, we will finish off with a fairy tale or short story, read as close to the original author's version as possible. I am your host, Freya Victoria. I'm an audiobook narrator that loves reading fairy tales, novels, and bringing stories to life through narration. I'm also fascinated by talking to authors and learning about their why and how for creating their stories. We have included all of the links for today's author and our show in the show notes. Today is part 2 of 2, where we are talking to Golden Angel about her novels. Over the past 2 weeks, you will have heard about her incredible journey of writing 70 books in 10 years, how she got into the world of TikTok and her author tips for authors, and her writing journey both indie and traditionally published. A Season for Smugglers, Deception and Discipline Book 3. Will his daring debutante rescue reveal the traitor to the crown? Lily Davies' first and final, if she has anything to say about it, season in London is mercifully coming to an end. Exhausted by the parade of balls, importuning gentlemen, and the endless dismissal of her suspicions about a certain captain, Lily wants nothing more than to return to her quiet life of country walks and intensive study. Unfortunately for this blue stocking, she is besieged en route to Derbyshire and kidnapped by a highwayman. In London to assist his brother, the brand new Earl of Talbot, Captain Nathan Jones, is on the hunt for the traitor to the crown. But when it becomes clear that Miss Davies' life is very much in danger, Captain Jones is dispatched to ensure the reluctant debutante travels safely. Escorting her safely home will also give him the perfect opportunity to question Miss Davies about the highly dubious gifts she's been receiving from the French. As Captain Jones becomes the unlikely hero to a very uncooperative damsel in distress, he quickly learns that rescuing Miss Davies is only the beginning of his troubles. One unfortunate compromise leaves this pair with no choice but to head for the altar. And the unnecessary distraction just might ruin his opportunity to uncover the identity of the traitor once and for all. Now, we did not talk about, so you have 70 books under 2 different names. How do you come up with what you're going to write about? Like, where do the ideas,
Oh
like,
god,
what
I wish I could
inspires?
stop. Um, I have literal notebooks full of story ideas. Yeah, no, the story ideas just never kind of stop. Whenever I read something, whenever I watch something, if something happens in my life, if my friends are telling me a story about something, like literally everything, my brain just starts going, oh, well, that's kind of cool. But what if it happened this way? And it's like, yeah, I can't, it's a thing that I cannot seem to turn off.
Mhm.
And in my head, like what before I started writing, it would be like, oh, what if it happened this way? And it would just kind of like play out in my head.
Mhm.
And maybe it would play out again if it was a really interesting thing, or I like might go in a different way, but then something else would inspire me, and then that story would play out in my head. And then once I started writing all the story ideas down in my little
Mhm.
notebooks. And I'm never going to get to writing all of these stories ever, ever. There's too many. Um, yeah, if anyone is just having trouble coming up with ideas for stories,
You'll gift
let me
them one of
know.
your
I'll give you
notebooks.
some.
That'd be an awesome
Um,
an awesome writer gift. Here's a
yeah,
book of ideas.
yeah, because I can't turn it, and it's like it's not just that some of them are full on like plot outlines, like chapter by chapter what they should be, and which is funny because I never managed to follow that. I write it out, but I never managed to follow it. Uh, but
So
yeah, I have
you're
them.
more a pantser or more a planner?
So I have to have the outline. I have discovered I have tried writing without an outline, and I
Mhm.
freeze up almost immediately. However, my characters rarely follow the outline. So I've learned to put my outlines in Word or something that I can easily delete and retype or move things around or
Mhm.
whatever. Um, Yeah, I have to have the outline or I can't write, but I'm a discovery writer, so as I'm writing, everything changes.
Well, that is super unhelpful for you.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I'm like, my process sucks.
It's
Like,
here's the plan, we're gonna follow the plan. Okay, let's ball it up and throw it out the window because that didn't
right.
happen.
Exactly. I wrote I wrote this beautiful outline for a book, which is now Arabella's Taming. And that is the book that has gone the most off the rails ever. Within the first 2 pages, as I started writing, everything started changing. Like, new character introduced himself that was not in the original plan for the book. Like, all of a sudden there was this secondary, like, kind of love triangle thing going on, which was not in the original plan for the book. And it was to the point that, like, 2 weeks before the book released, I sent my newsletter the original outline for the book, because I was like, all right,
Here's what it was
this book is
supposed to
coming out
be.
in 2 weeks. Here's the original outline. I don't mind sending it to you because it is nothing like the actual book. So if you ever wanted to know, like, a peek behind the scenes of how closely to my outlines do I follow the book, this is the farthest I've ever gotten. But I held on to the original outline so that you guys could see how off the rails this book went.
Yeah, like, "Wait,
Um,
what happened to that book?"
yeah, it never got written. I could probably still write it, and no one would know that it was the original outline for Arabella's Baby, because they would be such different books. Yeah.
Yeah, so I started and got about 30,000 words into my first book, and then my brain went, "Hey, so what if we did this instead?" And I'm like, "No, no, 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 we need to finish this one," and it went, "No, no, 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 but here's a whole storyline for a series instead."
Yep.
So this weekend, I finally made the decision this last week, like, thinking over it, I'm like, "Alright, we're gonna push pause, and we're gonna start working on the other one," because, like,
Yeah.
I can't get my brain back to over there right now, so maybe if we, like, give it a book from a series, it'll let me
Right.
finish.
A lot of the time, what I'll do is I'll write down all my ideas. Like,
Mhm.
I've had that where a full series pops into my head. So I write down all the ideas and I'm like, all right, and now I need to finish this and then I can work on this. And sometimes just writing out all the ideas isn't like enough. It's like,
Mhm.
all right, well, I've written it down. And so the anticipation is still there, but like I can go back to focusing on what I'm supposed to be focusing on.
Well, I don't have anyone, on me for finishing it. I'm like, I want something out by the end of the year, but we're not even halfway through the year yet. So that's,
Right.
that's a
Yeah.
lot. And I type like 90,000, 100,000 words a minute. So like I can
That's
type
awesome.
very quickly and I had like one weekend where I got like on a Sunday, like 6,500 words done in one day. That was the
That's
last weekend
fantastic.
that I got any decent amount of writing done on the book before it,
Right.
it went sideways. But I'm like, it'll eventually get there. But now I'm going to have to like reread through it and keep going. And
Yeah.
eh.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have a few books that I, like, started and never finished. It happens. It
Do you ever
happens.
get
It's
back
just
to them or do they just sit there?
not yet. They're just sitting there.
So, what
Like
is
I said,
the
sometimes all I do need to do is get the idea out. So I'll, like, write the first chapter or the first few chapters, and then I'll just be like, "All right, but I need to finish this other thing," and so I get back to the thing that I'm supposed to be working on, and then I just never get back to that shiny new, like, just working on it a little bit was enough. My brain was like, "Okay, we're good."
so
But
what is
yeah,
the
I
next
will say I don't have that happen too often, but I also don't let myself do too many, like, side projects too often
Yeah,
anymore, because it is my income and family is relying on it.
right.
It's a whole different kind of pressure on the whole thing.
At this point, I'm just like, as long as the narrating brings in enough to cover the podcast costs, which isn't a lot at this point, I'm like, "We're good." So,
I love that.
I'm like, all I need, like I think I'm like I don't know, there's the advertising and then so I'm like at
Mhm,
400 a month, I think is what I'm spending out in like advertising across multiple podcasts and then, hosting fees and all of that. So I'm like, as long as we're
mhm.
bringing in enough for that, we're all good.
I love that it's like yeah, it's you're narrating in order to support your podcasting habit.
Hey, whatever works. So
Yeah.
far since I started, I have yet to have a month where that did not happen, so
Yeah,
I'm keeping up with it.
I
But
love it.
unlike, because I hear from being on, so I'm like, my TikTok is very much in the I get narrator stuff and author stuff and reader stuff. So, like, I'm getting, like,
Oh,
all the book things. And so,
nice.
there will be, narrators that will come up and will say, um, like, they're doing it part-time, and they're like, "How do you, get books done in a reasonable amount of time?" or whatever, and it's like, you just at the beginning, at the very, very beginning, you have no idea how much audio you're
Right.
gonna be able to get done in a day, like, no clue. But then once you kind of learn, "Okay, I can get this much read," and so, like, me personally, I can get an hour and a half of audio done roughly in a day, and that's
Mhm.
recorded, fixing all the mistakes from the how do words come out of your mouth incorrectly when you're staring at a page,
Yep.
and then, getting it edited to where it's, retail ready to get loaded up to Audible. Yeah, I see those kind of questions, and then I've also seen authors, I've been hired, I had a publisher hire me, and they're like, "Oh, it's a 9-hour book, that should take you about 9 hours, right?" And I'm like, "No."
No. Not even a little bit.
I'm like, "I mean, I could do it, but it's not gonna sound good."
Yeah. It's like, yeah, sure, if you don't care about the quality.
Yeah, but I'm like, "I can tell you it's not gonna pass quality control because it's gonna
Yeah.
be
Oh,
awful."
yeah. It's ever since like I always figured like a lot went into it, but after my husband started doing some of it and like really getting to see how much goes into narrating the audiobooks, I'm like, yeah,
Mhm.
no, you're earning that per finished hour fee.
Well, and I've seen a few, like, authors recently asking, like, narrators I've seen a few actually ask, like, "Do you" well, they're asking readers, "Do you prefer first person or third person?" I'm like, "As a narrator, here's my opinion." And they're like, "Oh, never thought about it like that." Because, like, as a narrator, it's very well, for me, I don't know how other ones are, but for me, it's a little hard to get into a third person because you're detached a little bit from the story,
Hmm.
where, like, I can get very emotionally into a first person narrative. So when, the spouse dies or gets really injured, like, you get into the emotion of that. Or with third person,
Right.
you're like, "And then he got stabbed, and it was so sad." Like, but still
Oh.
trying to, like, bring I just finished narrating a third person it was my first third person one, and I'm like, "I feel very weird, like, doing this, like, detached thing," but it kind of
Oh.
worked out because she changed perspectives a lot, so, like, you might
Mhm.
be with the main character, and then suddenly you're with the villain, and so, like, I'm like, it actually made it easier because I didn't have to read entire chapters in other people's perspectives.
Right, yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense.
So you work with do you work with the same editor all the time, or do you have different editors that you work with for your
I
books?
currently work with the same one. I've been through a few. Right now, I'm with Sandy at Personal Touch Editing, and then I did also my most recent book that released on Thursday, a season for Smugglers. I did have an extra developmental edit for that from Jennifer Bene, who's another author.
So what are
Um,
the I've kind of asked an editor about this, but what is the difference between the because I think she gave me, like, 3 different editing options. What is the
right.
difference?
So a developmental edit is kind of more all encompassing. It's looking for plot holes. It's looking for things that you've missed. It's looking
Mhm.
for, are these scenes in the right sequence? Is the pacing correct? Is the um does the character progression, like, is
Makes
that
sense.
right, makes sense? Is there anything like, and I've done developmental edits for some of my friends, and I'm, things that I'll look for are like uh one of my friends, she had um phase and shifters, and she had her heroine fighting off this massive fey prince lord with all this magic and stuff, and then the hero sees her do this, and then the hero's ex shows up and she's just a regular shifter, and they're having this fight, and he's all scared that his ex is going to hurt her, and I'm like, he just watched her, like, he's already seen her fight off. I was like, "You have to switch the fight scenes." I was like, "This one cannot, the shifter, the fight scene with the X needs to come first because otherwise there's like, it's just
Yeah,
not
it d
that, you need the
he
high
sounds like an
stakes one
idiot
at
at
the
that
end."
point.
Right. And I was like, "You need both. Like, I understand why you have both. You do need both. They just need to be flip-flopped." Um,
Yeah, I guess I have an
Another one that I
author
did.
that I narrate for that I guess I kind of do that for her. So I'm, like, reading through her book, like, ahead of time, and she had said when she, like, picked me as her narrator, she's like, "Hey, if you find any errors in the manuscript, let me know and I'll fix them." I'm like, "Okay, cool." So I start, reading through it ahead of time as a narrator should do. And I'm like, "Hey, I'm finding a few things, which is fine, but, like, do you want me to, like, throw this into a Google Drive and I can send you, like, comments
Oh,
and you
that's
can
so
say if you
nice of
like
you.
it or not?" And she's like, "Sure." So that's now I do all of her books that way, but the first one that I did for her, it was, like, this group of friends that had, like, known each other since high school, and, like, the first chapter jumped into, like, she's been gone for a while and now she's moved back, but you didn't get any of the, like, them in high school part of things. And I'm
Mhm.
like, "Can we add a prologue where, like, you see them in high school so this all makes more sense?"
Yeah, yeah,
That's
like, and
I guess
that's,
that's
yeah,
kind of what I was doing was developmental whatever.
right, like, just looking at the story as a whole,
Mhm,
basically. And then you get, like, the line edits,
mhm.
which is just, like,
The
going
actual
through
fixing.
sentence structure, stuff like
Mhm.
that. And then proofreading, which is more about grammar, misspelling, stuff like that.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, and then there's also content editors, which honestly I'm not entirely sure
You don't
how
use
much
one
of it.
clearly?
Yeah, it's like I'm not sure what the difference between them and developmental edits are, but
Mhm. I'm one of
um,
those probably because, well, 1, I've been reading my entire life, all kinds of different books, and
right.
2, I just have like, I'm very, very good at, like, editing things myself and, like, reading through and catching issues like that, so I'm like, I'm gonna attempt to do it myself and see how it goes.
Yeah, it is harder when it's in your own work because,
Mhm.
like, I can do it for other people, but like my brain skips over what I know is supposed to be there. Like,
Right.
so if there's a word missing, my brain knows that word is supposed to be there, so it sees it there. So
Right.
like sometimes even like when I get line edits back, they're like, "Fix this," and I'm like, "Fix what?" And I have to like stare at it and I'm like, "Oh, it is. It's missing a word there." Like you don't see it right away. It's crazy.
That
But it
happens to
wasn't
me
even hard.
narrating.
Yeah,
I'll, like, read a sentence and I'm like, "Did that really not make sense, or did I just read it wrong?" And I'll, like, read it back and I'm like, "No, that really didn't make sense here." And I always get permission ahead of time from my authors, like, if I find something that's obvious, this is what it was supposed to say, is it okay to just
right.
fix it and move on? Where
Yeah,
if it's something that it's like and I don't know that I've had this happen yet, but if it was something that was, like, some major, like, the author would need to approve the fix, clearly
right.
I'm gonna ask before
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah. Yeah, no, and honestly, reading it out loud is like if you're gonna self-edit, reading it out loud is a hack
Mhm.
to help you do that, or having the computer read it to you,
Mm.
because it that way you're not relying on your eyes, and auditory processing will help your brain find the things that need to be fixed more than
Right.
reading it yourself.
Right.
Um, so those are actually two ways that a lot of people do when they do self edits. That's two ways that are have proven very very useful for people who are preferring to do it on their own.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm just
So,
like, do I want" it's not even like, do I wanna spend the money, but the, like, researching to find someone that actually, like, knows what they're doing.
yeah.
So, plus it's, the series one that I'm working on is very much I have to do a little bit of research to make sure it's, like, mythology based,
Mhm.
and so, like, I have to do enough research into mythology to make sure that I don't get those, "Oh my god, why did she completely change everything about everything?"
Right. Yeah. 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 like, yeah, Disney's Hercules. I mean, it's fun, but it's not Greek mythology.
Yeah, see, I don't want mine to be that way.
Yeah,
Like, I would I will be changing it slightly, but not any of the, like, things that are gonna get me in trouble. It's still a
right.
fantasy genre because that's mythology is a subgenre of fantasy, but it's like, yeah, no, I would like to not get booed off the stage at my first go.
Oh, love it.
So do you have has your, like, family read your books? I imagine they know that you write, but,
They do know. My mom has read. I gave her. Well, she more does audiobooks, so I gave her a free code for one of my paranormal books, which has no kink, and they're steamy, but very steamy scenes, but no kink. And she was like, "That was nice, dear. It's not really my thing." And I'm like, "You agree with your book club. Don't give me that." But I think it's weird for her knowing that I wrote it, so
Right.
I was fine with that. But yeah, they know what I write. Her My mom's cousin and her daughters all read my books, which I think is hilarious. Because her daughters, when I saw them over the summer, they were like, "Oh, I want to read some of your stuff. Like, what do you write?" And I was like, "Ask your mom." Because she reads it.
Yeah, I have so
Um,
for my narrating, I do both steamy and not steamy, and so I'm like
right,
my mom and my sister, I'm like, "I'll just warn you ahead of time, like, if, like, you don't want." So I did one that was a YA and there was, like, there was, like, a kissing scene in there, it was
right.
very, very tame, so I'm like, "This one would be a good one for you to listen to. This other one, no." But then my sister-in-law was like, "What name do you narrate under?" And so I tell her, and she's
Mhm.
like, "Oh, I'm listening through one of the most raunchy ones I've done so far." And I'm like, "Really?"
Um, and see, and in some ways, that's why it's better for them to know because then if they want to avoid your work, they can't.
Yeah, well, I told her 1, it's classified erotica, so,
Right,
like, she would have seen that, but I was like, read the blurbs because 'cause I'm like, I don't know what she's gonna wanna listen to or not. I was like, just make sure to read the blurbs because I don't
right.
wanna hear it if you don't read the blurb and then you're like, "Why was there sex in here?"
Yeah. But yeah, I am personally of the mindset that it is best to tell the family because one of my friends, she just became a full-time author recently, and I asked her if she was going to tell her stepdaughters who are both teenagers, like
Mhm.
getting ready to graduate high school soon, and I was like, "You're going to tell them your pen name?" She's like, "Oh, no, no," and she's like, I just think that would be so traumatizing for all of us." And I was like, "What's more traumatizing, you telling them now?" Or in 5 years,
You see their
them being
books on
like,
your
"Oh,
shelf.
this is my favorite author," and you knowing
Yeah.
that it's you, and then
I
having
remember
to
seeing a
decide.
TikTok like that. I don't remember who it was, but she had her therapist or something, she had her book on her shelf, and lady's like, "Oh, I love that book," and she's like, "Oh, thanks."
Yeah.
She's like, "No, really, it has my face on the back." Like, yeah, so,
Oh,
my day job, I occasionally have background checks run, so I can't use my own
right.
name, and then I have some family that are a little more on the conservative side, and so I'm like, "We just won't tell them what name I," like, they know what I do. Like, I was talking
Right.
to my grandma a couple weeks ago, and she's like, "Oh, you're writing a book? That's so cool," and I'm like, "It's not the kind you would wanna read."
Right. I love it when I see the dedications that are like, "Dear mom and dad, please don't read this. If you do, it's your own fault."
Right? It's like the TikToks where, like, their family finds their TikTok or like,
Yes.
students in the school find the TikTok and it's just like, "Nope, that wasn't me."
Wasn't me, don't know what you're talking about.
Now
Yeah,
you
no,
can't really do that, your hair's very distinct, so you would
it is. But,
have a
I
hard
mean,
time.
the hair is new though. I mean, I was writing for 9 years without the hair.
Oh, okay.
So,
It was a TikTok
yeah.
exclusive then.
The hair was actually my celebration for becoming a full-time author. My day job was at an accounting firm. I'm not an accountant. I didn't do any accounting, but it was at an accounting firm, and so I had to have a professional appearance. And like the wildest thing that they ever let me do with my hair was I was allowed to dye a little bit of the back underside, as
Okay.
long as I always wore my hair down outside of my office and no one actually saw it.
Ri so
So
the peekaboo? I think that's what
Yeah,
that's called?
kind of
Yeah.
the peekaboo thing, yeah. And so my thing was like when I become a full-time author, because I wanted to dye my hair crazy colors. So I was like,
Mhm.
when I become a full-time author, I'm gonna dye my hair something white, like pink or purple or whatever. And so that's what happened. After I became a full-time author, I dyed my hair purple originally, and then I kind of have gone through a few things, and I've landed on the pink to purpley blue ombre. Um, which I think is where we're staying because I really like it. So
I thought
yeah.
about going to, like I wanted to do this really cool, like, rainbow thing, but my hair does not bleach, like, it does not and I was
Mm,
red, my natural hair is blonde. I was a redhead for 10 years before I finally was like, "I'm tired of keeping up with the red." So I
yeah,
switched to now I'm, like, a really dark brunette. Um, but yeah, I had briefly thought before I went to brunette about going to, like, some kind of colored thing, and then I'm like, the upkeep," and then my hair doesn't bleach, so I'd have to, like, let the red grow all the way off first, and, like,
right.
ugh. So, in
The
college, I had a
upkeep is
brief
just
period of, like I think I had, like, a pink streak and a purple streak at one point in college, but that's, like, all that I've
nice.
ever done. My mom,
Yeah.
on the other hand, she has a mohawk that is always colored
Oh,
different colors, so
I love that.
she's very easy to find. Find the person
Yeah.
with whatever color she has at the time.
Yes, I have also become very easy to find, I've realized. I was like, "This is actually a benefit."
Some depends on who's trying to find you, I
Well,
guess.
that's true. But, like, if we go somewhere and there's a crowd, I don't have to worry about whether or not my friends and husband can locate me.
Yeah, have you seen the person with of course, nowadays, that's
There's a lot more
eh
people.
yeah, because like, my mom's been it's funny because like, my dad, when I was growing up, was like, you can't color your hair at all," and then, like, when I was in, like, junior, senior year, it was okay as long as it's natural colors, and
Right,
then it was like I don't know at what point he let my mom do or okayed my mom her thing, she wanted to have blue hair at the like, that was her big, "I want
right.
blue hair." And eventually that got okayed, and then he loved it after that. So it
Yeah.
it
It's
was like a
I have been
progression.
noticing so many more people with the crazy
Yes.
colored hair in the past couple years, and I love
Yes.
it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been crazy because it was I mean, you knew people, like, colored their hair or whatever, but yeah, the
Right.
what are they called? The fashion colors
Yeah.
nowadays and there's so many brands that make them now where before it was like, go to Sally and your manic panic is all you could
Yeah,
get.
that's the only one. Yeah, no, so now I actually do a lot of my own, touch-ups, like, I use Pravana,
Mhm.
and so when it starts to fade and I like the color it fades to, but it does, like, hit a point. So then I'll put in my own color, and I don't actually go to the salon until I need the roots done. Um, I'll touch up my own color because you can now, there's so many
Yeah.
options.
Well, and
So,
playing with bleach is a lot different because you do that wrong,
yeah.
and, like, your your hair's
That I'm not
frying off.
doing. Yeah. That's a no, thank you.
Yeah, my hair's like let's see, last time we tried to bleach it, it was, like, a multi-week, multi-application process, and some of it still didn't lift, so it was like, "We're just not trying that again."
Wow. Yeah,
So it's when I
that's
say it doesn't like it, it really it doesn't do
so
anything. So
fascinating.
different hair.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
So
Mine lifts really easily and
mm,
really quickly because I have pretty dark hair, but when the first time we did it, they're like, because we did one thing and it was like, okay, actually that went a lot faster and lighter than we thought it would. So now we're just gonna do the bleach, like the bleach rinse or whatever it's called,
mhm.
with the shampoo and stuff. And that was it. Like, and we thought it was gonna take like 3 applications, and it was just like the first application and then the rinse, and it was like, all right, good enough. Let's go ahead and make it
Nice.
purple.
Now we've gotten way off topic here. So
Yeah, sorry.
so you were finishing up a book today. So what is next for
So
you?
yes, I am finishing up Law and Disorder, which is the third book in my Masters of Marquis series, which is my one of my main series. So I have my historical spankings, which is season for Smugglers, just released in on Thursday. And I normally try to not have a release and a writing deadline on the same week, but Law and Disorder was supposed to be done last week, and I didn't make that deadline. So now it is what it is. And that book will be out in June.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, that's my so like for people whenever people like ask what they should read from me, I'm like, well, my historicals are a little bit more like dubcon when it comes to the spankings and stuff because I can because it's historical. So if you
Mhm.
want like explicit consent and like so I call them kinky books or spanking books, whereas
Mhm.
my contemporaries are BDSM because they have explicit consent and
Mhm.
communication and all that stuff.
Rules. There's usually
Yes.
rules.
Yeah, there's rules governing how
So you have
they
2 different you have your little bit cleaner and then you're definitely not cleaner
yeah, yeah,
things.
love that. But yeah, this one was fun though. I got to it's interesting. Season for Smugglers was just released. I had to do a bunch of research into steam powered sex machines. Had to. I did. I did a bunch of research into steam powered sex machines because I wanted one in the book.
Mhm.
And then for Law and Disorder, I don't know. I must have still kind of had that kind of stuff on the brain because I ended up deciding to do some have some fun with electrical play, which is kind of like the modern version of steam powered sex machines. So,
So, basically, you're on someone's watch list for what the heck
probably.
is this person doing with her search history?
I mean, at least I'm not murdering anyone. I'm like, with the romantic suspense authors, I'm like, y'all are definitely on someone's watch list because
Right?
between it's like gotta have because the heroines are like getting kidnapped too. So like you've got
How to kidnap someone
ways
properly.
to right, like how to kidnap people, chloroform, bombs, ways to dissolve a body. Like at least I mostly stay away from
Yeah, I
that.
had someone so the book that I paused, has like it's a fantasy superhero, but it's like they become
Nice.
superheroes because of a, vaccine gone wrong. And so I had a nurse on Twitter was like, "Oh, if you need a beta reader for it, whatever, whatever." I'm like, "I set this in the future so I could essentially do what I wanted with the medical tech, but thanks." So
Yeah.
I'm like, "This is definitely stuff that would not happen nowadays, but in 20 years, who knows?"
Yeah.
So
Oh, that is one of the things though, because it's like you'd think because I've done a little bit of I have a few sci-fi books and I
Mhm.
used to read a lot of sci-fi and it's one of those things where it's like you can do what you want, but then at the same time it's like I still end up doing research because I'm like I don't want it to be like I still feel like I need to understand how certain things work so that I can make
Mhm.
it mostly believable.
Right.
It's and I also just like research, like, it's also a thing that I enjoy doing, so
You're talking to the person that just bought literally 10 different mythology books for researching,
nice.
so but
Do
I'm
you
like,
have, Dioralis's Book of Greek Myths? That's my
I
favorite one.
so because of what I'm doing, I had to go with ones that, so it'll be, like, different mythologies kind of combined
Oh,
together, and so I had to get, like I actually found one author that I think he's like a professor of mythology or something, because he had, like, a book with, like, a bunch of, like, Greek and Roman and Norse mythology, and then he had one with, like, the Native American, different ones combined
mm,
together, and then, like, African, and, like, he had, like, groups of, like, the different continents, basically, of mythologies
right.
in a book together, and so I did those, and then I did a couple of, like, encyclopedia pretty much ones.
Oh, that sounds cool.
So, but I'm
I
like,
like
I'm like, I need a broad overview, so that's the encyclopedia. Like, I need the
right.
short paragraph version of about, the different
Yeah,
gods and goddesses and stuff, but then I also need to go more in depth to make sure, like, is Zeus a psychopath really in the myths or not?
right.
So,
Yes, yes, he is, or at the very least, a sex addict.
yeah, so that will be, eventually I'll get started, but yeah, I'm not like in-depth research, but like for the vaccine one, I was like at one point I was talking about like something happens to the main character and she needs to go to a mental health professional of some sort, but I kept calling it like I kept changing what I called it, like psychiatrist and psychologist and therapist. And I'm like,
Oh,
what
yeah.
are the difference between these? Because I need to pick which one because we can't just
Yep,
keep changing it. So
yep, yep.
but then I kept calling it, "You need to see a doctor," and I'm like, "Okay, which one of those would be considered a doctor?"
I
The
think all
things
of them,
you learn no,
actually.
not all of
No,
them. Not
interesting.
all of them. So, no, there was, and I don't remember now. I think it was a psychologist is the one that's actually a medical doctor. The other one, it's more like a not a certificate, like, you still have to go to school and get degreed, but you're not called doctor whatever at that point.
Yeah. I do know psychiatrists are who you go to for medication. That's because I always saw a psychologist. And then if I was, they were, because I have generalized anxiety and depression. So at one point we were talking about putting me on medication. And in order to do that, I was going to have to go see a psychiatrist because they're
Mm.
the only ones that can give you the,
So that must be the doctor one then,
yeah.
because most of the time, not doctors aren't gonna be giving medications
Yeah.
legally.
Because I was seeing the psychologist for behavioral therapy, and then the psychiatrist would be for the actual like messing around with your brain chemistry and stuff.
Fun, fun.
Um,
I want to say we're about done for today, but I want to say thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to I swear I get your videos every time I hop on TikTok. I get at least
oh
one of your
gosh.
videos, so
Well, I hope they're entertaining.
well, it is helping me though because like some of the stuff you give about like should you go wide or not go wide or whatever, like those are helpful for someone who's, has to start thinking about those things.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it is helpful to me. So I appreciate them and I
I'm so glad.
typically watch unless it's one they keep repeat videoing me. So
Oh,
like if it's one
interesting.
I've seen before, I'll skip it, but
Right.
typically I
Yeah.
watch them through.
That is much appreciated. Thank you. And thank you for having me on here. This was fun.
No problem. You have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you. You too.
Golden Angel's favorite fairy tale when she was a kid was Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty, or Little Briar Rose, also titled in English as The Sleeping Beauty in the Woods, is a classic fairy tale about a princess who is cursed to sleep for 100 years by an evil fairy, to be awakened by a handsome prince at the end of them. The good fairy, realizing that the princess would be frightened if alone when she awakens, uses her wand to put every living person and animal in the palace asleep to awaken when the princess does. The earliest known version of the story is found in the narrative Perse Forest, composed between 1330 and 1344. The tale was first published by Giambattista Basile in his collection of tales titled The Pentamerone, published posthumously in 1634. Basile's version was later adapted and published by Charles Perrault in Histoires aux Contes du Temps Passé in 1697. The version that was later collected and printed by the Brothers Grimm was an orally transmitted version of the literary tale published by Perrault. The Arne Thompson classification system for folk tales classifies Sleeping Beauty as being a 410 tale type, meaning it includes a princess who is forced into an enchanted sleep and is later awakened, reversing the magic placed upon her. The story has been adapted many times throughout history and has continued to be retold by modern storytellers throughout various media. Today we'll be reading The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, another adaptation of Sleeping Beauty by Charles Perrault. Don't forget, we are also continuing the original story of Beauty and the Beast on our Patreon. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. There were formerly a king and a queen who were so sorry that they had no children, so sorry that it cannot be expressed. They went to all the waters in the world. Vows, pilgrimages, all ways were tried, and all to no purpose. At last, however, the queen proved with child and was brought to bed of a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. They found 7, that every one of them might give her a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days, and that by this means the princess might have all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremonies of the christening were over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, knife, and fork, all of pure gold set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were all sitting down at table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy, whom they had not invited because it was above 50 years since she had been out of a certain tower, and she was believed to be either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but could not furnish her with a case of gold as the others, because they had 7 only made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted and muttered some threat between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard how she grumbled, and judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, went as soon as they rose from the table, and hid herself behind the hangings that she might speak last, and repair, as much as possible she could, the evil which the old fairy might intend. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her for gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should have a wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play upon all kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn coming next, with a head shaking more with spite than age, she said that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell a-crying. At this very instant, the young fairy came out from behind the hangings and spake these words aloud. "Be reassured, O king and queen, your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true, I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with the spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep which shall last 100 years, at the expiration of which a king's son shall come and awake her." The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, caused immediately proclamations to be made whereby everybody was forbidden on pain of death to spin with a distaff and spindle or to have so much as any spindle in their houses. About 15 or 16 years after, the king and queen being gone to one of their houses of pleasure, the young princess happened one day to divert herself running up and down the palace. When going up from one apartment to another, she came into a little room on the top of a tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her spindle. This good woman had never heard of the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there, goody?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Ha," said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it? Give it to me that I may see if I can do so." She had no sooner taken the spindle into her hand than, whether being very hasty at it, somewhat unhandy, or that decree of the fairy had so ordained it, it ran into her hand and she fell down in a swoon. The good old woman, not knowing very well what to do in this affair, cried out for help. People came in from every quarter in great numbers. They threw water upon the princess's face, unlaced her, struck her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with Hungary water, but nothing would bring her to herself. And now the king, who came up at the noise, bethought himself of the prediction of the fairies, and judging very well that this must necessarily come to pass, since the fairies had said it, caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for an angel. She was so very beautiful. For her swooning away had not diminished one bit of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation and her lips like coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly till her hour of awakening was come. The good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess, but she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf who had boots of 7 leagues, that is, boots with which he could tread over 7 leagues of ground at one stride. The fairy came away immediately, and she arrived about an hour after in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of the chariot, and she approved everything he had done. But as she had a very great foresight, she thought, when the princess should awake, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace, and this was what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace except the king and queen. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards with their beef-eaters, pages, footmen. She likewise touched all the horses which were in the stables, as well as their grooms, the great dogs in the outward court, and pretty little Mopsy, too, the princess's little spaniel bitch which lay by her on the bed. Immediately upon her touching them, they all fell asleep, that they might not awaken before their mistress, and that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits at the fire, as full as they could hold of partridges and pheasants, did fall asleep, and the fire likewise. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their business. And now, the king and the queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace, and put forth a proclamation that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all round about the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles twining one within another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that, too, not unless it was a good way off. Nobody doubted, but the fairy gave herein a sample of her art, that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years were gone and past, the son of the king then reigning, and who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, being gone a-hunting on that side of the country, asked what were those towers which he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone answered according as they had heard. Some said that it was a ruinous old castle haunted by spirits. Others, that all the sorcerers and witches of the country kept there their Sabbath or night's meeting. The common opinion was that an ogre lived there, and that he carried thither all the little children he could catch, that he might eat them up at his leisure without anybody's being able to follow him, as having himself only the power to pass through the wood. Ogre is a giant with long teeth and claws, with a raw head and bloody bones, who runs away with naughty little boys and girls and eats them up. The prince was at a stand, not knowing what to believe, when a very aged countryman spoke to him thus: "May it please your royal highness, it is now above 50 years since I heard my father, who had heard my grandfather say, there then was in this castle a princess, the most beautiful was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be awakened by a king's son, for whom she was reserved." The young prince was all on fire at these words, believing without a moment's doubt that he could put an end to this rare adventure, and pushed on by love and honor, resolved that moment to look into it. Scarce had he advanced towards the wood when all the great trees, the bushes and brambles gave way of themselves to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, which he went into, and what a little surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow him, because the trees closed again as soon as he had passed through them. However, he did not cease from continuing his way. A young and amorous prince is always valiant. He came into a spacious outward court, where everything he saw might have frozen up the most fearless person with horror. There reigned over all a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. He, however, very well knew by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the beef-eaters that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they fell asleep in their cups. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where the guards were standing in their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders and snoring as loud as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came into a chamber all gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed the curtains of which were all open. The finest sight was ever beheld. a princess who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and in a manner resplendent beauty had somewhat in it divine. He approached with trembling and admiration and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awakened, and looking on him with eyes more tender than the first view might seem to admit of, "Is it you, my prince?" she said to him. "You have tarried long." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. His discourse was not well connected, but it pleased her all the more. Little eloquence, a great deal of love. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had time to think on what to say to him, for it is very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had entertained her with pleasant dreams. In short, when they talked 4 hours together, they said not half what they had to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awakened. Everyone thought upon their particular business, and as all of them were not in love, they were ready to die for hunger. The chief lady of honor, being as sharp-set as other folks, grew very impatient, and told the princess aloud that supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed and very magnificently, but His Royal Highness took care not to tell her that she was dressed like his great-grandmother, and had a point band peeping over a high collar. She looked not a bit the less beautiful and charming for all that. They went into the great hall of looking-glasses, where they supped, and they were served by the princess's officers. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but very excellent though it was now above 100 years since they had been played. And after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Almoner married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honor drew the curtains. They had but very little sleep. The princess had no occasion, and the prince left her next morning to return into the city, where his father must needs have been anxious on his account. The prince told him that he lost his way in the forest as he was hunting, and that he had lain at the cottage of a collier who gave him cheese and brown bread. The king, his father, who was of an easy disposition, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded this was true, and seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, and that he always had some excuse ready when he laid out 3 or 4 nights together, she no longer doubted he had some little amour, for he lived with the princess above 2 whole years and had by her 2 children, the eldest of which, who was a daughter, was named Aurora, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day, because he was even handsomer and more beautiful than his sister. The queen said more than once to her son, in order to bring him to speak freely to her, that a young man must e'en take his pleasure. But he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared her, though he loved her, for she was of the race of the ogres, and the king would never have married her, had it not been for her vast riches. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogreous inclinations, and that, whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to refrain from falling upon them. And so the prince would never tell her one word. But when the king was dead, which happened about 2 years afterwards, and he saw himself lord and master, he openly declared his marriage, and he went in great ceremony to fetch his queen from the castle. They made a magnificent entry into the capital city, she riding between her 2 children. Some time after, the king went to make war with the emperor Cantalbute, his neighbor. He left the government of the kingdom to the queen, his mother, and earnestly recommended to her care his wife and children. He was like to be at war all summer, and as soon as he departed, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law and her children to a country house among the woods, that she might with the more ease gratify her horrible longing. Some few days afterwards, she went thither herself and said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I have a mind to eat little Aurora for my dinner tomorrow." "Ah, madame," cried the clerk of the kitchen. "I will have it so," replied the queen, and this she spake in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat, and will eat her with a sauce, Robert. This is a French sauce made with onions shredded and boiled tender in butter, to which is added vinegar, mustard, salt, pepper, and a little wine. The poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with ogresses, took his great knife and went up into little Aurora's chamber. She was then 4 years old and came up to him jumping and laughing, to take him about the neck and ask him for some sugar candy. Upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went into the backyard and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such good sauce that his mistress assured him she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken up little Aurora and carried her to his wife to conceal her in the lodging he had at the end of the courtyard. About 8 days afterwards, the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I will sup upon little Day." He answered not a word, being resolved to cheat her as he had done before. He went to find out little Day and saw him with a little foil in his hand, with which he was fencing with a great monkey. The child being then only 3 years of age, he took him up in his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in her chamber along with his sister, and in the room of little Day cooked up a young kid very tender, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. This was hitherto almighty well. But one evening this wicked queen said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I will eat the queen with the same sauce I had with her children." It was now that the poor clerk of the kitchen despaired of being able to deceive her. The young queen was turned of 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had been asleep. Her skin was somewhat tough, though very fair and white, and how to find in the yard a beast so firm was what puzzled him. He took then a resolution that he might save his own life to cut the queen's throat, and going up into her chamber with intent to do it at once, he put himself into as great a fury as he could possibly, and came into the young queen's room with his dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the queen-mother. "Do it, do it," said she, stretching out her neck. "Execute your orders, and then I shall go and see my children, my poor children whom I so much and so tenderly loved." For she thought them dead ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. "No, no, madame," cried the poor clerk of the kitchen, all in tears. "You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. But it must be in my lodgings where I have concealed them, and I shall deceive the queen once more by giving her in your stead a young hind." Upon this he forthwith conducted her to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and cry along with them, he went and dressed a hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite, as if it had been the young queen. Exceedingly was she delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king at his return, how ravenous wolves had eaten up the queen his wife and her 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling around about the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in a ground room little Day crying, for his mamma was going to whip him because he had been naughty, and she heard at the same time little Aurora begging pardon for her brother. The ogress presently knew the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had been thus deceived, she commanded next morning by break of day, with a most horrible voice which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she caused to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all sorts of serpents, in order to have thrown into it the queen and her children, the clerk of the kitchen, his wife and maid. All whom she had given orders should be brought thither with their hands tied behind them. They were brought out accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub, when the king, who was not so soon expected, entered the court on horseback, for he came post and asked, with the utmost astonishment, what was the meaning of that horrible spectacle. No one dared to tell him, when the ogress, all enraged to see what had happened, threw herself head foremost into the tub, and was instantly devoured by the ugly creature she had ordered to be thrown into for the others. The king could not but be very sorry, for she was his mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and his pretty children. To get as prize a husband rich and gay, of humor sweet, with many years to stay, is natural enough, 'tis true, to wait for him 100 years, and all that while asleep appears a thing entirely new. Now at this time of day, not one of all the sex we see doth sleep with such profound tranquillity. But yet this fable seems to let us know that very often Hymen's bliss is sweet, although some tedious obstacles they meet are not less happy for approaching slow. 'Tis nature's way that ladies fair should yearn conjugal joys to share, and so I've not the heart to preach a moral that's beyond their reach. Thank you for joining Freya's Fairy Tales. Be sure to come back next week to hear Ariana's journey to holding her own fairy tale in her hands and to hear one of her favorite fairy tales.